I'm going to pose a question to you, and I want you to think about it in terms of your operation and for your customers. I want to know, how do you define maternal? I would guess if I ask multiple members, I might get slightly varying answers in terms of their definition of the term maternal. I think where we would find some common ground would be that heifers breed early for the first time. They continue to have a calf on schedule in the herd every year, and they do this without having other issues, such as issues with their feet. They're pretty docile, and that udder quality is going to hold up year after year as that cow ages. I think those are some of the things as we think about maternal that we can all find that common ground as we move forward on. Now, there might be some other things that you think of maternal in your herd that can be a little harder to quantify. Maybe some of those maternal instinct type traits. So we're not going to disagree on that, but I do think as we move forward, let's think about how we can improve maternal. And with that, what information do we have available today? What information do you have available today to be able to quantify those maternal type traits? And as we think about that, what are the traits today that can be measured in order to be able to quantify for a genetic selection tool? Where we're headed today is that we're going to discuss 3 traits that the association will soon have in the research EPD format, and we'll talk about the subsequent updates to the maternal weaned calf value index that will take place with these 3 research EPDs. So we're going to talk a little bit at a high level about our functional longevity research EPD, and we're also going to talk about our teat size and udder suspension research EPDs that will soon be released. So the goal of this is to allow you the opportunity to gather education about these 3 traits, the updates to $M, think about that information, and come prepared to the town hall Zoom sessions that we'll be having in your region to ask questions and engage in discussion around these traits and these updates. So as we go through this, be thinking of those questions and those discussion points, and then join your regional Zoom town hall style meeting to have those discussions about today. So let's start with that functional longevity research EPD. If you remember, this is a research EPD that was released in October of 23. We updated in February of 2024, and we're anticipating our next update for this particular research EPD in August of 24. So to give a high-level review of this functional longevity research EPD, this is a trait that's evaluating cows that stay in the herd, and they also produce a calf every year. A female that's 10 years old in the herd that's only produced, say, 5 or 6 calves is not the same productivity level of that 10-year-old female that has produced 9 calves in her lifetime. So the definition of this trait is that on average, we're looking at the number of calves a sire's daughters are predicted to produce by 6 years of age compared to other sire's daughters. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but the data that's used inside of this evaluation includes both calving and culling records. So let's take a dive into the data for functional longevity. So the first question that comes to mind is, well, how much data is in this functional longevity evaluation? This particular evaluation includes data from both the American Angus Association and the Canadian Angus Association. So within this evaluation, there's about 1.9 million cows that have records, and those 1.9 million cows can have multiple records since they calve every year. So those 1.9 million cows together have generated 8.3 million records total inside of that evaluation. It also includes our genotype population of 1.5 million animals, and as a result, there's about 4 million animals in the pedigree that would have EPDs predicted. So I want to spend a minute talking about a little deeper dive into what data is inside of this evaluation. Because today, the majority of the data is from outside of our inventory reporting program. If you remember, our inventory reporting program was started in 2012, so just a little over a decade old. And in that time, there's been about 276,000 females that have generated 1.2 million records for this evaluation. That group of females laid the foundation to be able to move forward with a functional longevity trait to have in research. Alongside those inventory reporting females, we're also using data from the AHIR program in general. And so from that program, we have had 1.7 million females generate 7.1 million records. So we are using data from both inside of inventory reporting, but then the AHIR program as a whole to get to our total of 8.3 million records. So as we take a little deeper dive into what records are used, I mentioned that inventory reporting data, but we're also using those calving and culling records that you have been submitting to the association since 1990. A caveat for females to have their phenotypes included in this evaluation is that they do need to calve as a 2-year-old female approximately. So they calve as that 2-year-old female in order to start generating her records in the evaluation. We are using records on females from ages 2 through 10, which means that a female could have up to 9 possible calving events in her lifetime. For this trait, the phenotype is the number of calves, and the model that we're using that we're not going to get into too much detail on today is that we are using a random regression model, but there is a reason why this matters to share with you. So before we get into the details of that particular model, I do want to take a look at the distribution of cows with records in this evaluation, and let's look at it by age. So along our x-axis, we have the age of females starting from 2 through 10. Then we have the number of records on the y-axis. So we can see that at 2 years of age, that's our largest category, which makes sense since females have to have that 2-year-old record to start into this evaluation, with 1.9 million females having a record at about 2 years of age. You can see at 3 years of age, that drops off a little bit to 1.7 million, and you can continue to look down through age 10 and see how those records continue to decline as we would expect as females leave the herd, maybe for being open or maybe they're being sold to a commercial producer, and so then we no longer are getting records into the association on that female. So let's talk about the heritability and the genetic correlation across ages for functional longevity. So the functional longevity heritability is 0.09, and as we look at our heritability trajectory, we can see that at age 6, we maximize that heritability at that 0.09. So what we can see through random regression is that we do have a heritability predicted at each one of those ages, and we can see that at 6, we do peak that heritability at 0.09. What else we have the opportunity to take a look at is that we can see that EPDs across those ages and how they correlate. So if you take a look at this table, there on the diagonal in bold would be those heritabilities that were just in the last chart, but then across each column, we have the correlation for those EPDs. So if we look at that age 6, where we maximize heritability at that 0.09, we can see that at age 7, age 8, age 9, and age 10, we're highly correlated to what we predict at age 6, which means predicting this at age 6 does a good job and minimal re-ranking of ages 7, 8, 9, and 10 to predict this particular trait. So as we look at the research EPD overview, we can see that, like mentioned earlier, there's about 3.84 million animals that have EPDs predicted for functional longevity. We can see that the average EPD for this trait is right about 1.01, with a spread of about 1 calf between our minimum and our maximum of 0.39 and 1.48. Standard deviation of this trait is 0.08. Now for accuracy, we see that average being at about a 0.21, but our spread goes from a low accuracy animal at a 0.05 up to a maximum accuracy of 0.95, which would be a highly proven animal for this trait. So as we look at functional longevity, we take a look at one example of how do we use this EPD in practice. If we have 2 sires and we're comparing the EPDs on them, we have the functional longevity EPD of sire A at 1.5, and sire B is 0.5. So the difference of easy math is a difference of 1. So how we interpret that is that on average, we expect sire A's daughter to produce 1 more calf by the time they are 6 years of age compared to sire B's daughters. So if we put that to a breeding objective, if your breeding objective is to increase the number of calves produced, you'd be looking to select a sire that has a higher functional longevity EPD compared to a lower functional longevity EPD. Now, as we talk about functional longevity, and we talk about it in terms of being a maternal type trait, we have to remember that it's not about the individual cow. We oftentimes think about maternal traits in terms of the cow herd, as we should, but as we think about it in terms of genetic improvement, it's not the focus on the individual female. It's really about the aggregate of information that's provided by sire's daughters and how long are those groups of sires' daughters being able to stay in the herd and continue to produce calves year after year. So with any trait, but specifically something like functional longevity, complete data reporting is absolutely critical. We need to know when she had a calf, but we also need to know when she did not have a calf and why that happened. Our inventory reporting program allows members to make sure that every female in their operation gets a production record every year, whether or not she had a calf. It also allows to enable the future research and development of new tools from programs like inventory reporting. I'd be amiss to not remind everybody that we do have 2 enrollment periods a year. For primarily spring calving herds, the next one is going to be November 1st to January 15th. And if you're a fall calving herd, you should be looking at that May 1st to July 15th timeframe to enroll. We kept functional longevity today at a pretty high level. We've done a webinar on this trait previously, and so I'd encourage you to go watch that webinar, as well as review the by the numbers that are published in the Angus Journal or the research report that's on the website. So we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about the 2 new traits that are coming into the research EPD phase. So this is going to be for teat size and udder suspension. So what we know about teat and udder conformation is that a quality udder absolutely influences profitability of the cow herd. A female that doesn't have issues is a female that you're not having to milk out after she calves, and that calf is getting high quality colostrum right after birth. We also know that this is a leading cause of culling females in the herd, which ultimately lowers those cows' longevity in the herd and impacts her lifetime productivity. We also know that extremes of any udder, being too pendulous, too big of teats, or held too close to the body cavity with too small of teats, can become detrimental at some point. If we're on one end of that scale or the other, and that calf is unable to suckle right after birth and get that high quality colostrum, it can have lifelong impacts on the immunity of that calf and impact to pre-weaning mortality if that calf does not get that colostrum right after birth. We also know that suspension that's held too close to that body cavity can also impact productivity of that particular female. And it never fails, we all know this, that if a female with a poor udder is going to calve, she's going to do it in the middle of the night, during a blizzard, whenever you're supposed to be somewhere else, but you need to stay home to help milk out that udder, to help take care of that calf. Now, we're not going to get into the anatomy and the physiology of the udder, but there are a couple of things that are pretty interesting that I want to point out. So the udder is made, as you know, of 4 separate quarters, meaning that each quarter functions independently of the other 3. What's neat about this is, as maybe you've seen on your operation, is that if a female gets mastitis up in one of those quarters, it stays contained to that quarter, and the other 3 are still producing high quality milk. As we talk about the breakdown of udders and we talk about a breakdown of suspension, we're actually talking about the breakdown of that suspensatory ligament that runs down the middle of the udder. So that is a ligament that's holding and supporting that udder close to the body cavity, and as a female ages or that udder starts to break down, we'll start to see that ligament break down to cause that. Now, as we talk about the structure of the udder and how that ligament functions, let's talk a little bit of how do we score udders for the American Angus Association. So the association does have a scoring guide available. These are available online, or you can contact the office to have one mailed to you. But on the front side of this, it goes through the details and the guidelines of scoring. And on the back side, it has example sketches of each one of the scores, 1 through 9, to be able to have reference for what an udder of a score of 1 or what a score of 5 or 9 might look like. There's also a scoring video available that goes through, if you're out in the field, how to evaluate an udder and how to best walk through determining if that is a score of 5 or if that's a score of 6 or 7. So it goes through some real life examples with video next to the sketches and tries to walk through some of those examples to help learn how to score on your operation. Now, as we take a look at the guidelines for scoring udders, udders should be scored within 24 hours of calving. Reason being, this is a very critical time in that calf's life to make sure that that calf has the opportunity to get adequate colostrum, but it's also whenever that calf is going to be suckling the fullest udder that that female will have. It's going to have the most pressure on that udder, and so it gives you the opportunity to really evaluate that udder before the calf has totally nursed it out. As we're scoring, you should be scoring the weakest quarter for both teat size and udder suspension. So we evaluate all 4 quarters, and then we choose the poorest quarter for both traits to score. We score the traits independently of each other on the same quarter using their 1 to 9 scale, and we can also use the intermediate scores of a 2, 4, 6, or 8. As we're scoring females, we should be scoring without consideration for age. We know that as a female ages, that udder will change a little bit in its conformation and start to break down. So we have age accounted for in this model for the traits. As with any trait, one person should score all females in a group to keep the consistency of the score to help the evaluation take care of that bias. Scores should be collected whenever you are taking the calving ease or birth weight data, and it should be submitted right alongside that calving book information to the association. Now let's take a first look into some of the data for teat and udder research EPDs. Please remember that this is preliminary information. The research report will be finished later in August that will have the final research information and statistics for these traits, but we wanted to give you a preliminary look at how the data in these traits look today. So as we look at the distribution of the scores for both teat size and udder suspension, what you're going to notice is that these pie charts look very similar. In the population, we don't see a lot of those scores of 1, 2, or 3. They do exist, but they're just not the majority of the data. So a score of 1, 2, or 3 is going to be the bottom end of that scale. It's going to be a more pendulous udder, or it's going to be a more bulbous, larger teat size. As we start to look more at those intermediate 5, 6, 7 scores, we can see that that takes up the majority of the scores that we see in our population. And we can also see there that on the upper end of the scale, those scores of 8s and 9s are representing about 14% of the scores that we see today, respectively. So as we start to look at this evaluation for both teat size and udder suspension, today the data that's in the evaluation is only from the American Angus Association. So from the association, there are about 89,000 females in the evaluation, and those females have about 147,000 records. So what that means is that females have been scored more than one time. They can be scored every year that they have a calf. And so females are getting scored multiple times, which is how those 89,000 females have generated 147,000 records. This evaluation also includes a genotype population of 1.5 million animals, and there's about 2.4 million animals in the pedigree for this trait. Now what I want to take a look at is the distribution of those repeated records that come in. So again, those about 89,000 females have 147,000 records approximately. So if we look along our x-axis, we can see the number of times a female was scored, and on the y-axis we can see the number of females. So for example, there have been about 52,000 females that have been scored one time, about 23,000 that have been scored twice, 8,000 that have been scored 3 times, and you can continue out across this particular graph. So if you go all the way out to the age of 14, there is one female that has been scored 14 times, meaning she is at least 15 years of age. So on the flip side of that, it's also important to talk about when these data points have been coming in. So if we take a look back at about 2009 to 2020, we remain pretty consistent in terms of the number of scores that were being generated each year. The reason being is that members that have been using the AIMS software to collect their data had the opportunity to be recording teat and udder scores if they so choose in that system. In 2021, we added fields in the AAA login for data submission, so it opened up the opportunity for more members to be able to submit those scores to the association. 2021 is also whenever we would have released our scoring guide, and we worked on that scoring video as well to help generate more information about how to score females. So we can see after we got those fields added into login, where a lot of members are submitting data, 2022 we had about 35,000 records submitted, and then in 2023, closer to 45,000 records. So again, as we think about there's a lot of females that have only been scored 1, 2, maybe 3 times, that directly reflects whenever this was added to login for members to submit data. So we anticipate continuing to see more females that will be scored multiple times during their lifetime. So let's take a look at each of these research EPDs. So we're going to start with the teat size EPD, abbreviated Teat. So this is going to be a trait that's expressed in the units of teat size score with a higher EPD indicating smaller teats. So again, the teat size scores range from a 1, which is going to be very large and ballooned, to a 9 that's going to be very small. As we all know, those longer, thicker teats are going to inhibit calf suckling, which can decrease the intake of colostrum and again, can increase that risk of pre-weaning mortality. Now, as we look at the udder suspension EPD, abbreviated UDDR, this is going to be expressed in units of udder suspension score with a higher EPD indicating a tighter udder suspension. So again, a higher EPD is going to be moving you up that scale closer to a score of 9. So again, the scores are going to be ranging from 1 to 9, and a weak suspension or those low scores are going to be indicating a lack of support from that ligament that we first talked about that ties the udder to the cow's body and allows how far down that udder will hang. Again, a very pendulous udder is subject to other injuries or other issues. So let's take a look at the heritabilities and correlations of these particular traits. So there going on the diagonal would be our heritabilities. So the heritability for teat size would be moderately heritable at a 0.32, and our udder suspension heritability is similar with a moderate heritability of a 0.28. One of the common questions is, what's the correlation between teat size and udder suspension? And our correlation between these traits is a 0.77. So it's a higher correlation, but it's not a 1. A highest correlation would be a score of 1. And so because it's a 0.77, that indicates that these are separate traits, which is why we have 2 different evaluations for them, which result in 2 different EPDs. So we do anticipate a release of teat and udder research EPDs coming in August of 2024. When those EPDs are officially released, we will have that final research report that will have that final research information and statistics that might vary a little bit from what you see today once they get into that final research report. The research EPDs will be made available to any members that have submitted teat and udder phenotypes and that have females with EPDs predicted. The final research report will be available on angus.org as well as emailed out to members that receive those research EPDs for teat and udder. And there's also going to be a by the numbers article in the Angus Journal in September of 2024 that will have more information as well for both of these traits. So this leads to the question of what's next for these 3 traits? Well, our plan is that they're going to stay in a research environment for the next several months. We're going to continue updating these research EPDs as more data comes in, but it also allows you the opportunity as members to review these traits, review them in your herd if you got them back on your females, and provide us feedback. We want to make sure that the EPDs that move from research to production are the best EPDs that we can have for the Angus population. We're also going to be working through estimating the genetic correlations with other traits. We know this is of interest for both functional longevity and our teat and udder traits, for how they're correlated to the other traits that we have today. And we're also going to be working through modeling the functional longevity teat and udder traits into our maternal weaned calf value, or that $M index, which will also eventually impact that $C index since $M is included in $C. So let's talk a little bit about the maternal weaned calf value updates and how these 3 new traits will impact $M. Before we get into the future of the maternal weaned calf value index, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page for the definition of this particular trait and how we interpret it. So maternal weaned calf value index is a bioeconomic index that accounts for not only the outputs or those EPDs, but it also accounts for the associated inputs or those costs to get the outputs. So this is an index that is expressed in dollars per head, and it's looking at the profitability from conception to weaning. Now, like any bioeconomic index, it is based on a breeding objective. So the breeding objective is how we start to build assumptions to be able to have the index function. So operations that would fit inside of this breeding objective would be operations that own and replace females within the herd, and they sell the rest of their cull females and all male progeny as feeder calves. So essentially, this is an operation that they're creating their own replacement females, and any female that doesn't make the cut, and then their counterpart steer mates, they're all leaving and being sold as feeder calves. This index also assumes that a commercial producer is replacing 25% of their breeding females in the first generation, and then 20% of their breeding females in each subsequent generation. So this is maybe not an index that fits every operation, but it is looking at the value of that weaned calf and putting the cost back on the cow. So if we take a look at what this maternal weaned calf value index is doing today, it is designed to place greater emphasis on the cost side of commercial cow-calf production. When commercial producers are selecting on $M, they're working to decrease their overall mature cow size while also maintaining the weaning weights of those calves. They're placing decreased emphasis on that maternal milk value, while at the same time also increasing the emphasis on traits like heifer pregnancy and docility. Selecting on $M will also work to improve those foot traits over time. What I think is important to note that in this maternal weaned calf value index, traits post-weaning are not included. Again, this is a conception to weaning focused index, and so we're not looking at post-weaning type traits. Now, what you see in that chart included on this slide is that this is what we call a response to selection graph. So what it does is that it looks over the course of approximately 10 years, if a commercial producer were to use $M as their selection tool, what direction would traits be moving and what impact? So this particular example compares $W to $M, but it helps to give an idea that over time, again, we're decreasing that overall mature cow size, maintaining weaning weights, improving heifer pregnancy and docility, and those foot traits, etc. It helps to put that in a picture form for what selection on this index will do over time. So if we take a look at that maternal weaned calf value index today there's 9 traits included in this value. Now what we know is that each one of those traits takes up some portion of a pie. If we want to think about it, that there's 9 traits, they somehow account for 100% of that index. So it's not only accounting for those outputs, it's also accounting for the cost to get there. So we can see that today inside of this $M value, that about 23% of the pie is taken up by the number of calves. So we think about things like calving ease and heifer pregnancy. As we look at the weight of those calves that are being produced, that takes up about 27% of our pie. So that would include traits like weaning weight and our milk. Now, as we look at cow cost, again, you'll remember this is a trait that's focusing on the cow cost side of commercial cow-calf production. That's going to be taking up approximately 50% of that pie today. So that's going to be looking at traits like our mature weight, our docility, our foot score. What are those costs associated with those traits? Now, as we move forward and we think about what $M could look like in the future, and note the question mark after this, because this is a trait that's still in research with the Abacus Bio team. We've worked with this team previously as we create indexes, and they do a great job helping us to work through the research on these indexes. So what we have to remember is as we move forward to incorporate these new traits into $M, our pie doesn't get bigger. We don't move from 100% to 130%. We have that same pie, and the 3 additional traits have to work themselves in to that pie. So what other traits will be reduced, what will grow in terms of their impact in that particular index. And we have to remember that the impact of a trait is determined by its economic relevance and its impact inside of that breeding objective, right? So every trait is in there because it fits within that breeding objective, but then it gives us an output or that EPD, but what does it cost to get us there? So as we look to add functional longevity in teat size and udder suspension, we'll have to see how that pie adjusts with the addition of those 3 traits. We do anticipate an update to $M to include these 3 additional traits in that May-June of 2025 time period. That would be alongside our sire evaluation report update whenever we typically do updates to the evaluation. Keeping in mind, this maternal weaned calf value is also a part of our combined value index or $C. So updates to $M will subsequently also have updates to that $C value. So what's next to come for these 3 traits in research as well as that maternal weaned calf value? So as research continues to progress for both those 3 research EPDs, as well as working with that Abacus Bio team on updates to $M, we'll have more details and finalized information to share with you as we move closer to having that into production. Now, as a reminder, we do anticipate to update that Research Functional Longevity EPD for members inside of the Inventory Reporting Program in August. And we do also plan to release the Teat and udder research EPDs in August as well. So if you've been a member collecting phenotypes for teat size and udder suspension, keep an eye out for those EPDs to come later in August. I encourage you to join your town hall style Zoom meeting in order to be able to ask your questions and have those discussions and engage with us and others in your region for each of these traits as well as those updates to $M. We look forward to being able to answer your questions, engage in that discussion, and we're really looking forward to gathering your feedback and hearing your thoughts on these traits while they're still in research before they move to a production EPD phase. So I look forward to having you join us for those questions and those discussions with your regional manager on those Zoom meetings.